Buckle up. In the pop cultural landscape of 2021, all sorts of music, movies, and television gave evidence that there's no such thing as secular. For this mega episode of the Think Christian podcast, the whole team comes together to celebrate our favorites. I'm Josh Larson, your host and editor over at thinkchristian.net. This is the second year that we've done this now, gotten the whole band together to consider all the pop culture that came out in a given calendar year and talk about how it reflects God's gospel story. As we did last year at this time, we're recording this show and reflecting on a year that's beneath a pandemic-induced shadow of anxiety and uncertainty. It's our prayer at Think Christian that you've had some experience of God's mercy and grace in the midst of all that, and that our conversations might offer a small bit of encouragement. We've heard from listeners throughout the year that have testified to that, and it's our pleasure to be able to share some of their thoughts on this episode about the best of pop culture from 2021 via social media and via emails to tcpodcast@thinkchristian.net. We heard from many of you about your favorite TV, your favorite movies, your favorite music. So before we get to our picks from our regular panelists, and here's a bit of a teaser. We're going to talk about Reservation Dogs, The Mountain Goats, and Licorice Pizza. First, let's start with a choice from listener Aaron Potter. One of my favorite movies of the year was Disney's Encanto, a beautiful film whose characters and visuals celebrate the beautiful diversity of God's people and His creation. It felt very much like a film about the family of God. In the family madrigal, as well as in the body of Christ, everyone has different gifts and different strengths, but all are necessary to the flourishing of the community. Thank you very much for that, Aaron, and keep those picks coming because, especially if we don't mention one of your favorites on this show, we can give it a little time on the massive list we're compiling to put in the show notes for this episode. So send those suggestions to tcpodcast@thinkchristian.net. So Aaron there with a movie pick. Let's shift gears as we get into the show proper and discuss some of the best television of 2021. All right, we have a couple of good friends here to talk television, J.R. Forasteros and Michelle Reyes. It was going to be even better, should say at the top, that Catherine Freeman was going to join us and unfortunately was not feeling well when it came to time of recording. So maybe we'll find a way to hear from her. I know that her pick for one of her favorite TV series of 2021 is a show that both of you have seen. So maybe we can jump into that as well and touch on that. Actually, Michelle, I think you said it was one of your favorites, so that works out pretty good. I want to start a little bit more broadly here at the beginning and tackle a general question. So for me, the line between TV and movies just continues to blur, and I'm really curious how you guys are thinking about that distinction lately. What is the main difference for you? How do you explain the difference of the experience maybe of a series as opposed to a feature film, especially as we're watching more and more feature films in our homes now, the realm of TV. Movies have kind of invaded there. TV is starting to look more like movies. Is there much of a distinction for either of you? Maybe Michelle, you want to get us started on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question, especially one to ask during the pandemic as things have changed in terms of access as well. But I still feel that TV shows and feature films have different narrative structures. And what I mean by that is that a movie, a feature film is supposed to have a clear beginning, middle, and end, whereas TV shows are more episodic. They can have multiple beginnings, middles, and ends. The strength of TV shows is that they can do deep dives into different themes per episode, which can be so provocative and fresh. Whereas, oftentimes a feature film will take one theme and it's really sort of mapped out throughout the course of 90 minutes or so. And I'll use the MCU as an illustration because I'm a big Marvel fan. I think Black Panther is a feature film that does both really well. It has a clear narrative, beginning, middle, and end, but it does a deep dive into multiple themes in a really well done way. It has a tight narrative and complexity, if you will. That being said, I have, as much as I adore phases 1 through 3 of the MCU, I have been particularly frustrated with phase 4, which we saw mapped out largely this past year with a lot of TV shows, WandaVision, Loki, Falcon and Winter Soldier. I just felt like they missed the opportunity for doing long form narratives well. They didn't follow episodic formats. There wasn't an immediate hook of like, what's the main driving force? Who's the bad guy? Why is this important? And they didn't explore unique themes per episode outside of WandaVision. I also had the same frustration with the latest Spider-Man No Way Home. So I think that critique goes both ways.
Yeah, and I think the MCU is really blurring those lines, right? Because they have so many streaming series that connect with their movies. And
yes,
yeah, that's made things a little bit more confusing. How about you, JR? What's your experience like?
Yeah, I tend to agree with Michelle. I tend to think of it in how are they asking me to watch this thing? You know, Josh, I remember when, what was the Scorsese movie, The Irishman? Was
The Irishman, his last one?
You chided me because I said it took me like 10 sittings to get through it. And you were like, oh, just like he intended, But even implicit in that is this idea that this piece of storytelling was designed to be consumed in one sitting, right? Maybe multiple times. It's entirely possible that a director wants you to watch something like Memento, right? That single sitting story gets richer the more times you watch it, but you're not supposed to like watch 20 minutes, pause, go get something, come back tomorrow,
right.
Whatever. Whereas a TV show, I think, is designed to be consumed in multiple sittings. Even things that are binged, right? They stop and start. Now, again, to Michelle's point, I think it's done sometimes well, sometimes poorly. I think a lot of shows, the Netflix Marvel shows, not to keep picking on Marvel, but, a lot of times the critiques of a lot of those shows were they fit 7 episodes of story into a 13 episode bag, and it was like you felt a lot of like filler and drag. And it seemed often that form was dictating the story rather than the other way around. And I think what could be a promise of this blurred reality that we're living in is that a story could dictate, if this needs to be a 20-minute short film, let it be that. That's great. We have plenty of platforms that lend itself to that. If this needs to be a 90-minute feature, great. Go ahead and do that. If it needs to be a 3-hour feature, go ahead and do that. If it needs to be a 7-episode limited series or a 4-season TV show, we have the ability to do all of those things and let the story dictate the form. But again, we're not quite there yet. I think we still have an idea that things need to be 20 episodes or 13 episodes or 10 episodes or 90 minutes or whatever.
Well, and what's the reasoning behind those decisions? Are they creative decisions or are they business decisions, as you suggested? Like, is it a streaming service looking to fill so many slots, or is it a particular creative team looking to tell the story they want to tell? So sometimes those lines get crossed too. I think it also strikes me that it's a question of attention span, as you just described, JR. You say you want to sit down and watch a movie in its entirety, but do we do that at home very often? I try to. I think maybe that's one of the reasons I still lean towards the feature experience, because I find it, just naturally easier to do that. But I also find it easier to not do that at home and allow for interruptions. And at the same time, as you say, a streaming series, yeah, it does have built-in interruptions narratively, but the way these services are set up, they don't really allow for them, right? It's the button pops up. It's like next episode, 5 seconds. Now, does that really make it a continuous attention experience? Or are we just consuming more or less deeply? Because throughout those 4 episodes we watch in a night, are we watching with 60% of our brain and we are on our phones and we are, doing whatever else? So yeah, it's still kind of a Wild West out there, I think, that we're navigating our way through. But there's still a ton of good stuff out there as we want to get to and talk about those series that did grab our attention and hold our attention. And we wanted to finish. I mean, that's a litmus test these days, right? Am I going to finish this series? And we have a couple of picks here that you guys made for your favorite television of 2021 that definitely fall into that category. Let's start with Reservation Dogs. Now, this is a Hulu series about 4 indigenous teens just aching to escape their lives in rural Oklahoma. It's a comedy series. These are half-hour episodes created by Sterling Harjo and the great Taika Waititi. A lot of authenticity going on here. This is the first series to be filmed in Oklahoma. It features an almost entirely indigenous North American cast and production crew. I don't know if any of that captures the experience of watching this show, though. I have to say, I didn't know quite what to make of its tone and style after the first episode. By the second episode, completely hooked by the humor and the heart of it. So definitely stuck through to the end. You guys both loved this show. Let me jump back to you, Michelle. Why was this one of your favorites of the year?
Oh, man. Well, kind of to go back to what I mentioned at the beginning, I thought the TV show provocatively did a deep dive into a different theme or different aspect of life for Native Americans on a reservation, but through this juvenile perspective with this sort of comedic lens that these are just kids and, they're like saving up for California and they have like what, just a handful of dollars. I mean, so there's this humor overlaid. I did find two things. One, I thought it was very interesting that there are some interracial, intercultural dynamics. You have in the first episode conflict between the Native American teens and an African American mailman. In episode 2, which I think is by far my favorite episode of the entire series, you have this Asian doctor who's like the catch-all, like he does everything. He's the eye doctor, the foot doctor. Like there's so much tension, but once again through a juvenile perspective. And so I found myself like cringing and laughing. And there's that moment where the Asian doctor just gets so upset and he's like, I just want to go back where I'm from, And the kid is like, from China, and he's like, no, from San Diego, like, and I'm Korean, and it encapsulates so much of the humor and the awkwardness of those sorts of cross-cultural relationships. But episode 2, it had me in tears because what really became apparent right away in all of the things that these kids are doing, striving to leave and whatnot, like they're starved for attention and for kinship. And I remember one of the first questions I felt like I was wrestling with while watching the show was like, where's the parents? Where are the elders? Where are like the older people? And the whole episode is in the clinic, and one of the boys spends like less than 5 minutes with this older woman that he doesn't know in this hospital bed, and like he's like, that's my grandma,
Yeah.
And I think it's such a deeply biblical moment of our need for community and the importance of intergenerational, relationships, mentorship, and the grandma. Her eyes are closed and she's like dreaming like of this vision of the past when her people were more connected to the land and thriving and healthy. I feel like in many ways she's kind of passing this like visionary legacy onto this boy, and they just go outside and sit, in silence. And I felt like it was this kernel of hope in the midst of a show that's focusing on all the like hardships and negativity and the negative impact of the quote white man. There's always this white man joke per episode. It was like this small kernel of hope in the show that I found really touching.
Yeah, it's a beautiful moment, and I think speaks to the goodness of this kid too, because as you say, they're trying to raise money to escape to California, and a lot of petty crime is involved in that. But you see too, like this kid, I think it's Lane Factor as Cheese is the character, has this goodness of heart where this woman mistakes him for her grandson, and he's going to play along for her sake. I think kinship is a perfect word to use. I think it's what these 4 teens are seeking, and they find it somewhat together with each other. Some of them do have it at home. Each home life is different. And as you said, the episodes somewhat focus on a different teen each time, and we get to learn more about their home lives. But yeah, that's the overriding question, I think, is as they plan to escape to California, are they going to find more kinship there? Or might it be here on this reservation, even though they're not finding it in some ways? Is it possible that it could be created there in the ways you just described in that scene with Cheese and the older woman just sitting together? So yeah, that second episode, I agree. Totally the best one. Entirely takes place at this clinic. You get a sense of this entire community just by sitting in this one place where people come in and out. Was that a favorite episode for you, JR, or did you have another one that stood out to you?
Oh, I mean, asking me to pick a favorite episode of Res Dogs is cruel. I thought the last episode was beautiful. I thought Willie Jack's episode was really incredible. I mean, it was hard for me to pick a favorite. Listeners probably not surprised. I'm a white guy, right? And I'm like super white. My 23andMe is like all colonizer all the way down. Like I have no connection to the kinds of stories being told in Reservation Dogs. And I think one of the reasons I loved it so much was because oftentimes when people like me talk about diversity of storytelling or hearing other voices or things like that, it's from a position of like checking off a box or fulfilling a quota, as though it's not something that's actually going to be good. It's just something that we need to do to like pat ourselves on the back and feel good. And I think Reservation Dogs illustrates, much in the same way I think FX's show Atlanta did, that storytelling that is owned by the communities that are telling these stories is not sacrificing quality in any way. It's actually creating these spaces that are new, that are fresh, that are exciting, that are provocative, that are everything. You know, all of the things we want stories to be, in a way, just by listening to people that have been doing this stuff for a long time. Sterling, so I've been reading this book called We Had a Little Real Estate Problem, which is a history of Native Americans in comedy by an author named Cliff Nesteroff. And the author interviewed Sterling Harjo back when Harjo was like just beginning the process of making the show with FX. And so it's interesting to hear, you know, Harjo was part of an all-native comedy troupe called the 1491s. The warrior that Bear sees in his visions is actually one of Harjo's comedy troupe friends, that guy was one of my favorite characters in the show, because that character so often in a white-run show would be a stereotype who is just the like mystic, magical native person. But because it was coming from an indigenous person, it completely undercut all that in a way that still was about Bear's connection to his history and not only his family history, but his tribal history and their history in this land with the colonizers of this land. But it was also funny and fresh and relevant in ways that, like Michelle said, a teenager would probably experience these things, you know? It was such a breath of fresh air. It was so funny. And yet, Josh, you were talking about the tone, right? What I've been learning from listening to my Native friends and from Native people, I mean, as soon as this show came out, every single Native person that I follow on Twitter was in rapture about how great this show was and how much they felt seen, how much they recognized, like they were name dropping people from their own local communities who were the various people in the show. And it was very clear to me that the tone that made me feel uncomfortable and unsure in so many places was so much the tone that resonated with their lives. And I don't know, I received the show so much as a gift. It was such an opportunity for me to bear witness to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous storytelling in a way that I have never had the opportunity to before. And again, it was amazing and hilarious and great. It wasn't like something I had to endure, you know, to check a box and say like, oh, I watched it for Indigenous Peoples Heritage Month or something like. It was something I looked forward to every week.
Yes.
You know?
Not cultural vegetables, right?
Yeah.
I just wanted to add to that I think one of the most provocative things about the show is that it's such a deep dive into the life and experience and reality of Native Americans. And yet, I think the themes are laid out in such a way that it's extremely relatable to any Black or Brown community. You know, the issues of food deserts and unhealthy eating, you know, that like greasy fried bread kind of like every community, can relate to that. And the idea of wanting to get out, that desire to get out and to make it, to thrive somewhere else, which, JR, to your point, this warrior that Bear is having visions about, what he's actually saying is stay and make your community better. And so I think that those themes, wanting to get out, choosing to stay, actually doing good where you're rooted and where you're planted. I just felt like for me as an Indian American, and even for my husband Aaron, we binged watched the series together as a Latino, and even that episode where Bear is trying to impress his dad, and the whole episode is about him getting ready for his dad. You know, there's like an 8-second scene in that episode where he's like lifting weights, and you know, if you weren't paying too much attention, you just kind of watch it and move on. But for any any son who doesn't have a dad in his life, and there's that moment of possibly seeing him, that like 8 seconds of like him lifting weights, it speaks volumes to a young boy trying to like impress his dad, and the weight of that. And we were in tears at the end of that episode too. So I just thought, what an amazing balance they make of highlighting, centering the Native American way of life and experience in reality today, while also making it so relatable to any other Black or brown person watching the show, and to feel like, yeah, that I can connect with that relates in different ways.
Yeah, it's a balancing act that this movie kind of miraculously manages while being very funny, managing to be specific and universal at once. And it's, representing in that way the vision of the kingdom of God, where diversity is something that's honored and celebrated. It's not, the vision is not just this monochrome idea of what humanity looks like, but it's absolutely diverse and absolutely celebrated for that. You mentioned Bear, and such a great performance by the young actor there. We should probably go ahead and mention the 4 leads, and I hope I have these names right. Sounds like I already screwed up. Sterling Harjo is how you said it, JR, which I trust you as one of the co-creators. But the cast, DeFaro Wunatai as Bear, great sort of like, I guess, kind of the leader of the group, though that's part of the fun dynamic is who is the leader. But Devery Jacobs as Elora and Paulina Alexis as Willie Jack, we already mentioned. And then, mentioned Lane Factor as Cheese. Just the dynamic of these 4 and their individual personalities. And going back to the cultural element, what I found fascinating is that as these teens try to find themselves, amidst a number of cultural influences, one way you can see their striving/confusion is in their wardrobes, the way these kids dress. And think about the influences they have going on here. They have indigenous religion and traditions. We've already talked about colonial Christianity, which is humorously represented by this white Jesus motif.
Hey, white Jesus.
And then, such a great line. And then, youth culture and hip hop. So they're so layered, these kids, in what they wear. There are so many layers going on. And in some cases, their hair represents traditional Native American hairstyles, but then they'll have a pop t-shirt on, layered by something else over it. I don't know if White Jesus shows up in the costume design, but there is that portrait hanging in Willie Jack's house. And I love the greeting that Paulina Alexis gives as Willie Jack whenever she passes by.
What's up, White Jesus?
So a lot of great things swirling about in Reservation Dogs. And you nailed it, JR. I have a similar background to you. And the destabilizing experience I had in that first episode was exactly that. I'm seeing things I'm unfamiliar with. I'm hearing from folks I'm unfamiliar with. Even if it were just to be educated, that would be valuable. But you're right. The magical key of the series is that it does that while being hugely entertaining and hilarious. So highly recommended Reservation Dogs from all 3 of us. I think if we want to move on to the other TV series that we want to highlight, Mare of Easttown, we are all fans as well. This is the one that Catherine definitely wanted to pick when she had planned to be able to be with us. But sounds like Mare of Easttown is one of your favorites too, Michelle. This is a crime drama, a limited series. So one of those that is, again, blurring the lines. It's like an extended feature in some ways. It's not going to have another season after this, but yet is broken into different episodes. It was on HBO, and Kate Winslet starred, has the title role, plays a detective investigating the murder of a teenage mother in her hardscrabble Philadelphia suburb. Meanwhile, her own life is in disarray following her son's death by suicide and her own subsequent divorce. So, Michelle, you said this was one of your favorites of the year too. Tell me why.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'll first say there was 2 reasons why I even chose to watch the show. And the first is I love crime dramas. Broadchurch, definitely a favorite, and others. But also, too, Kate Winslet. When I saw that it was Kate Winslet, maybe this is going to reveal my age, but like I grew up watching like Kate Winslet and Pride and Prejudice, and then Titanic and whatnot. And so
of course,
I'm a big Kate Winslet fan. So I was like, okay, crime drama and Kate, this is going to be great. And it didn't disappoint. It's funny because as soon as we started watching the first episode, my husband and I, it was like, oh man, another cranky detective. Like, why are these detectives always angry angry at life and their lives are in shambles. I think that this TV series did a really good job at approaching her character in a new and fresh way and really giving nuance to layers of struggles within her personal life, marriage, her divorce, her son, even just, her sort of a sports past and how she's coming to grips with like middle age and like the days of glory behind her and like all of that. It was very refreshing. And I think also too, while it did kind of make everybody throughout the show feel like a suspect, where I was like, it could maybe at times on the nose a little bit, but it had such a surprise ending, which I appreciate. I never like watching a crime drama where like second episode in, I'm like, oh, I know who the killer is, and this was a total surprise ending and not who you would have imagined at all. And so I thought between the acting, the dialogue, just it was a slow enough pace to really feel like you understood the characters, the town, the dynamics, without it feeling too slow and you're like, I'm bored. I thought that was all done really well. And I thought their exploration of grief avoided was really, once again, I think in the midst of a pandemic, and all of us, I think, are just carrying our own levels of grief, felt so relatable. She's escaping to her work to avoid all of these layers and burdens of grief that she's carrying within her home life. And obviously, as the series goes on, it becomes unbearable and things begin to spill over, and she's forced to confront her own pains. But I just thought it was well done and really relatable, and she felt like a strong female lead that I felt like we needed in 2021.
Why do they call you Lady Hawk?
I made a shot in a basketball game, that basketball game, 25 years ago.
Okay. Must have been some shot.
Most places, no. Around here, yeah.
Yeah, and never too much Kate Winslet. I agree with you on that. That was probably the draw for me as well. JR, I know that you've seen Mare of Easttown, maybe not at the top of your list from last year, but what did you make of it?
Yeah, I came to it after multiple people texted me and said, have you watched this yet? And I kept saying, no, I haven't. I keep hearing good things, blah, blah, Finally, I was like, okay, we'll watch it. And, I was a huge fan of True Detective, first season, obviously, when HBO did that. So like Michelle, I love a good gritty crime drama. I love Tana French novels. I'm here for it. I thought it was funny a little bit that this show seemed to mimic True Detective in so many ways, especially the sort of like accent fixation that so many people were drawn to True Detective for. It was set in rural Louisiana, so you got the the good gumbo, thick kind of Cajun accent there. Here you get the like hardtack like Eastern PA, kind of thing. Which, I don't know, someone at some point is probably going to write something about why we are so attracted to these like hyper realized niche rural white crime drama things. I think what I appreciated about this show, especially honestly thinking about it sort of again up against Reservation Dogs, is it showed the sort of generational trauma that comes from like the white working poor. This is a community certainly that has not been as aggressively stamped out as Indigenous American peoples, but they have in many ways been ignored or used by, state and federal government for, voting, and then pretty much ignored beyond that. Very little investment in infrastructure, very little investment in social services or education or things like that. And so I think one of the things you see in Mare of Easttown is how broken Easttown is, how completely without hope so many folks in that community are, which is in many ways underpinning the whole crime. You see the state not only of kids these days, but also of their parents and their parents above them, and how all of this sort of combines to create this very dark place where there's not much hope. And, that's all embodied in Mare, which, to Michelle's point, it was fun to see a female be that lead role, because there's so many ways you could imagine Kate Winslet's being a man, and then you have another, again, you really have a True Detective spinoff at that point. But yeah, I thought that there was so much, it was just so much about how people are broken and how communities are broken, and then what that does to us, in the long term. And I just found that sad, but also really, really compelling. And I think, to Michelle's point, the surprise ending of the show really put a strong stamp at the end of that and said, like, yeah, this is what we're talking about.
It's a grim milieu. I mean, absolutely. Compared to Reservation Dogs, not a lot of comedy here. Maybe you get a little bit of it in moments of Winslet's performance. And for me, it was, to go back to her, that was the highlight of the series. I may be less inclined than the two of you to seek out sort of an extended mystery drama, just because you can sometimes see the gears cranking. And you mentioned this, Michelle. Yeah, it was good that they kept us guessing, but it was also like you almost couldn't invest in any revelation because you knew, well, we've got 6 episodes to go, and I'm sure this is not it. But Winslet, anchors it all. And I think it struck me what she's doing, what's so good about what she's doing is it's kind of two things at once. She has this tough, impenetrable wall that you were talking about, Michelle, that really defines the character. That is Mare. She's not going to let anyone in. She's not going to let the grief in or out. But at the same time, she allows little cracks so that the audience can deeply care for her. And I think those two things should be working against each other, and somehow Winslet balances them beautifully, so they're working in concert. She's just a deeply angry character. And to that point, we do have a post on the TC website by Robert Hubbard that really delicately explores that element. He essentially asks, when does anger, even righteous anger, destroy us? How do we overcome it? And then for a hopeful answer, even in this grim milieu, he leans on a few passages from Ephesians. So would encourage folks to check that out at thinkchristian.net about Mare of Easttown by Robert Hubbard. But yeah, maybe not an easy watch, but I think it was a rewarding one.
And I'll say a few comments. One, my dad's side, all of our relatives are in Pennsylvania and Delaware. And so the way that Kate Winslet is slurring her R's, like Warder and things like that, I'm like, that's my grandma. Those are my aunts and uncles. So I actually found that incredibly relatable. And then two, to the point of like every person feeling as a suspect, fans of the show were calling those red marings, because...
Little pun there.
Right. And then finally, I appreciate, so Roger Ebert, film critic, he talks about movies being empathy machines. And I really felt, to JR's point, that this TV series does that well for the poor working whites, especially for the girl who is killed, that the story revolves around. This is a young teenage girl who has nobody, broken relationship with her dad, obviously really bad situation with her ex-boyfriend, poor, no help, needing of her baby boy to get this ear surgery, her death, and also just the lack of agency that so many of these figures have. It really, even if you do not know somebody like this, it just kind of, you're able to enter imaginatively into that world and just understand the pain and the struggle that they're going through. And I thought that was another thing that this series did really well.
Yeah, and as you're describing that, Michelle, some of those situations we do see in Reservation Dogs as well, so different forgotten communities, but in some ways they're experiencing the same forgottenness and trying to work through it through their own cultural situations. And it's interesting how these shows I never would have thought of them as a pair, but as we're talking about them, I do see some things arising there. Let me hear, though, we spent a good amount of time on those two shows. Before we go, can I quickly get one more title from each of you that is maybe another TV show that you love from last year? If you were putting together a top 5 or a top 10, what else would be on there? Michelle, it sounds like not one of the MCU series would make it for you. So is there somewhere else you'd go?
Well, so Josh, you and I talked about Nine Perfect Strangers earlier last year. I thought that was just a wonderful exploration on health culture and just so much of what's happening right now in terms of like the self-help world. And runner up would be The Wheel of Time. I really enjoy Robert Jordan's books, and the fantasy series was entertaining. I think there was some missed opportunities for depth. It was just a really fun TV series to watch.
And Wheel of Time, you're working on something for Think Christian on
Yes.
that, right? So,
Yes.
all right, we
More to come.
will look forward to that. How about you, JR? What other series did you enjoy spending time with last year?
I mean, I cannot help but say Only Murders in the Building, the Hulu send-up of true crime podcasting, starring, of course, everyone's favorite comedy trio, Martin Short, Steve Martin, and Selena Gomez.
Yes.
So, seriously, I don't know how I know how Steve Martin and Martin Short have a long history together, but how Selena Gomez got into that mix, I don't know. I can't wait to read the oral history of it, but it is perfect. They feature regularly on her TikTok now. And I mean, that show, almost every episode, I was like holding my sides, crying, laughing so hard. And it's another murder mystery. It was just so funny. Actually, weirdly touched on some of the same stuff we've been talking about here in a much lighter way. And it couldn't be farther at the other end. I mean, it's the titular building is one of those fancy New York apartments that probably costs more than all three of us will ever make in our lifetimes, in a year. So incredible amounts of privilege there, but really a deeply funny show, I thought. And I there's going to be a season 2 coming. I can't wait. So,
All right, another good recommendation there. I want to add one from a listener. We did ask for listener picks for this show and heard from Kathy Lawrence. She emailed us at tcpodcast@thinkchristian.net and nominated the reality series The Voice, long-running show, but it was still one of her favorites this year. Kathy said, the singers this season were incredible. The top semifinalists were also good. It was hard to choose which one should win. They also allowed them to talk more about their faith and values and to sing Christian songs. When Jershika Maple sang Break Every Chain, it brought the house down and all judges to their feet. So thank you, Kathy, for that. We're going to add that one to the massive list we are compiling of best of year picks for the show notes for this episode. So you guys can check that out for a ton of recommendations. Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you, JR, for joining me. Quickly here, where can listeners follow you to keep up with your writings, other podcasts, anything else you're doing in 2022? Michelle?
I have a website, michelleamireyes.com. Lots of fun updates and freebies on there related to issues of culture and race. I'm on Twitter, Dr. Michelle Reyes, and then on Facebook and Instagram at Michelle Reyes. And, always up for the DMs.
All right, there you go. How about you, JR?
I am at JR Forasteros everywhere that's worth finding me. And a few places that aren't, just because I started an account and then it didn't turn into anything. So, okay. I'm still writing about faith and pop culture for TC and a few other places. And of course, our podcast, The Fascinating Podcast, will be back here in a couple weeks. So
great. Yeah, maybe a resolution for you. Close down some of those ghost accounts still sitting out there and unused social media platforms.
Foursquare, right? I don't need to be on Foursquare anymore.
Probably not. I mean, I don't want to judge, but all right. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to another great year of podcasting with the both of you.
Yes, likewise.
Thanks, Josh.
Hey there. Greetings from your in-house DJ, John J. Thompson, up to my earballs in amazing music from 2021. This time, the specially curated playlist I've pulled together is truly a team effort, though. Sure, it includes many of the songs that I believe came from the best albums of the year, but I've also included suggestions from our regular podcast contributors and some from the most critically acclaimed albums of the year, including I Need You from John Batiste, Julian Baker's Faith Healer, and a smidge of Johnny Greenwood's 25 Years from the Power of the Dog soundtrack, which you would have heard if you were listening to the show on any platform other than YouTube. But the list is packed with strong tracks, I promise. One of the songs is from an artist on Jack White's Third Man Records label that we've been talking about and got to talk to over at True Tunes this year. Natalie Bergman, lead singer, guitarist, and co-songwriter in the band Wild Bell, absolutely knocked me out with her album Mercy. Between her artful, dexterous, and sophisticated blend of West African highlife musical elements, classic girl group soul, and her stunning songs that dive straight into the heart of pain and loss and come out the other side in the form of simple, almost childlike gospel tunes. I just haven't heard anything like it. She did a single with Beck as well and dropped an EP right at the end of the year that feels like more tracks from the same album. I don't like to proclaim one album as the best of the year, but Bergman's Mercy was right up there this year, that's for sure. If you want to see my full list, you can find it over at True Tunes. But you can find this mix by searching for the Think Christian playlist on Spotify, where the episodes mix sits alongside all of the previous mixes and an archive mix that combines everything we've ever used, or you can click the link in the emails you get from us. Until next time, this is John J. Thompson, hoping your 2022 is off to a strong start, your instruments are finely tuned, and your batteries are always charged. Rock on.
Josh Larson back with the TC podcast. Let's take a cue from John J. Thompson there and stick with music. Claude Acho, Eric Danielson, and Sarah Welch Larson are here to talk about 2021's best albums. Before we do that, I'm curious to hear from each of you, what was your most played album during last year? Maybe it's the same as the best for you. Possibly time plays a little bit into this. It's probably an album from earlier in the year that just got a lot of repeats. But what did you guys end up spinning the most? Claude, maybe get us started here.
Absolutely. Without a doubt, listen to the most Donda by Kanye West.
Really?
Just now Kanye. So Donda was most spun, and also was a cautionary tale to purchase music when it comes out, because he revised and changed some choruses that were totally beautiful, removed Don Toliver from a wonderful song, and I cannot find the original version without breaking laws on the internet. So buy your music and keep it.
Yeah, because it's gone now. Yeah, especially with an artist like Kanye. Yeah, I can see that. Sarah, what did you listen to the most?
Mine is the same as my best of the year pick. I listened to a lot of Mountain Goats this year, and I listened to Darken here the most.
Okay. All right. We will definitely get to that then. Do you have something different, Eric, from your pick?
I do. Anyone who follows me on Twitter will not be surprised that once The War on Drugs, I Don't Live Here Anymore came out in late October, that just rewrote my entire most listened to list for the rest of the year. So that was on pretty steady repeat late fall through the beginning of the winter. So
a later release, but still made it up there for most listened. I like it. I'm going to say for me, it was Spotify tells me, that it was probably Lucy Dacus's Home Video. And I think I can thank you for that, Eric, because you and I talked about it on an earlier episode of the TC podcast. So I kept giving that more listens, just as we discussed, hearing those stories that she tells over and over again. But I don't know. I think maybe the soundtrack to Summer of Soul probably got just as many listens, but that's a tricky one too, because you start listening to that and then the algorithm just sends you into like deep cuts of great 70s R&B and soul, and before you know it, like 2 hours have passed by and you've gone well beyond that soundtrack, but you're still listening to stuff. So those two got a lot of listening time from me. All right, let's move on to our best album picks. And I'll tell you what, this is how I want to do it. You guys have chosen 3 artists that are pretty new to me. I'm certainly was familiar with their names, but I think Japanese Breakfast might have been the only music I had actually spent time with before. And again, that was thanks to the algorithm kind of selecting some of those tunes and serving them up on playlists. So I want to do it this way. I want each of you to play the part of the record store clerk, if you can remember back to those days when such people existed, and sell me on each of these picks. So pretend I only have enough cash to buy one of them. I'm at the store. I'm standing there at the counter. Why should your pick be the one? And especially tell me, why it should be the one because of the theological reflection that it might prompt. Does that sound good to you guys? Sarah, why don't you bring us back to Mountain Goats and talk to me about Darken here?
Anybody who knows me knows that I'm a Mountain Goats diehard. I think Eric mentioned once that every time he's on Spotify, he looks over at the sidebar and he sees that I'm listening to them. So we'll see if I can get you to that point as well. My one sentence pitch for this record in particular is that it's kind of a punk sensibility, but it's wearing a lot of Western clothing with really strong lyrics. So if you're into Bob Dylan, Johnny Cash, maybe even a little bit of flavor of the Decemberists, this might be a record that you might appreciate. A lot of really interesting hand-picking guitar and the piano that they use, it sounds a little bit clear and like a little bit old and almost slightly out of tune. And there's even a little bit of organ music in there. So there's a lot of different influences that are getting folded in there. I think on this record, there's also Spooner Oldham and Will McFarlane are both playing on this record. So there's a lot of like great music history, especially Western music, that's at play in this particular record. And at the same time, it's not pretentious about anything that it's talking about at all. So one of the Mountain Goats' strongest traits is that they're able to take really heavy material and then play with it. Like this can be a very playful record in a lot of places. It really treats the heavy material with a light touch. And then it also treats the lighter material very, very seriously. And it does so with an and not a but. So holding the tension of this is hard subject material that we're dealing with, and it's something that's also worth celebrating. So listening to just such a complex idea with all of these songs is just something that I very much appreciate.
All right. Well, yeah, that sounds like a great mix. And as you're going on there, it sounded like it could have gone pretentious. So it's kind of a relief to hear that you had that fun bit too, and that they're having fun with this stuff. Is there, if someone was starting out with them from this album, is there a song that you would suggest they start with?
So I'm going to kick off with a song that has kind of a pretentious sounding name, but
Okay.
The song itself sort of belies that. So the name of the song is The Destruction of the Kola Super Deep Borehole Tower, which is just a very, John Darnielle is the singer and songwriter for the Mountain Goats. It's a very John Darnielle song title. He usually starts off with the song title and then fills in the lyrics afterwards, and then they write the music to fit it. So it's a song about an actual place. There was a borehole that was drilled in Siberia that is still the deepest man-made point within the earth. They were drilling for oil, and the drill shaft got shut down in the mid-90s because they couldn't drill any deeper. Like, it was too hot down there. There's actually a myth that was circulated in the mid-90s that they drilled so deep that they could actually hear the screams of people who were trapped in hell, which is kind of a wild myth to be telling. And so the lead singer heard about this and said, I have to write a song about this. It's not a dark song in the slightest. It's very punchy, very percussive, very like upbeat tempo, talking about somebody who's going exploring, looking for this borehole and the tower that was once erected over it. The tower's gone now. There's really not much of a trace of it anymore. And it talks about maintaining a sense of wonder when you're going and looking for these deep and dark things. And then being able to ascribe that wonder and that awe towards something that's bigger than you. So much so that there's a line in the song that talks about, like, you crack through the crust, fall to your knees and praise the Lord. But it doesn't feel pretentious. It actually feels kind of playful. And it's a lovely tension that really is maintained throughout the rest of the album as well.
Sounds like, maybe what's going to happen in the next season of Stranger Things. Yeah, it sounds like something I'm definitely going to have to check out. All right, Claude, you are up. What's your pick?
So my pick, album of the year, is Nas, King's Disease 2. I would sell you on this, Josh, and interested listeners, just by sort of, you wonder, hip-hop is such a influential, monumental genre, obviously not just in our country, but globally. And one of the questions around hip hop is sort of, how does this genre age? It's sort of a young person's sport. And so it's been interesting to see what happens when sort of the great artists and lyricists and poets of hip hop, what happens as they age. And so we've seen that a little bit with Jay-Z, continues to rap and rap well, released the album 444 a couple of years ago. Sort of, my take is he had to release that because Beyonce made an album, Lemonade, about his infidelity. So he had to speak to that. And people looked at that and really praised it as an example of maturity. And I think King's Disease 2 is actually a much better example. Nas, one of the greatest, American artists, rappers, an uncanny poet, creative, brilliant mind, a wordsmith. He's kind of back in rare form. He's been making great music since the mid-90s, and he's kind of back at it. And with King's Disease 2, it's sort of a maturing of a person that you want to see, particularly in hip hop. He's trying to give kingly advice, essentially, is what's happening. And he's moved on from sort of not moved on from sort of street narration, but has an added maturity and perspective. And you can tell he's embraced this sense that in Nas's mind, he wouldn't use these terms, but he's a Paul to Timothy's, right? So you see that turn and you see that embrace. On top of that, artistically, he's in rare form, and he's teamed up with a young producer, Hit Boy, to sort of kind of bridge old and new. And the production is incredible. His lyricism is creative, and for the most part, you can tell he's striving for kind of mature thought and thinking deeply about his life and reflecting on it. And you sort of see that with songs like Death Row East, where he kind of looks back on his role in Tupac Shakur's life and his perspective on Tupac's assassination. And in particular, the song that I really like that actually has some really interesting resonances with the song that you mentioned, Sarah, the title that's too long for me to remember, but a song I really did like. So I am excited to listen to the rest of the Mountain Goats album. But the song from Nas's album that I liked a lot that really stood out to me is called My Bible. And it's a song where, again, playing on the title King's Disease, like King Solomon, like King David, dispensing wisdom, Nas is trying to do the same thing. And in this song, My Bible, he does so by looking at men, children, and women in each of the three verses and talking about the wisdom that can be gleaned from their experiences and then giving advice to each of them. And there's a lot of advice in sort of aphorisms and pithy sayings in the Mountain Goat song that you mentioned too, Sarah. And King's Disease is the same sort of thing. And so Nas will go so far as to say, men, don't rap about death. There's power in what you say. He'll tell the kids, I want to speak gospel for the next generation. You can have it all. Just don't side with Satan. And even things like your jewelry may be cursed. Like, be careful what jewels you buy. And then in the verse about women, he just kind of dotes on them. And Nas, it would be a larger conversation, a complicated dynamic with women, given some of his relationship with Khalees and some of the things and allegations there. So I want to be respectful of that. But I think the song My Bible is really interesting because it's Nas taking on the mantle of elder statesman in a way that a lot of rap artists say they're going to take on, but don't actually do. And Nas is groping. You can tell he's reaching in an Acts 17 sort of way, looking for transcendent moral and spiritual truth. And he's really sincerely, deeply applying himself to these things and trying to send that out to others, to the point that he ends the song by saying, I'm going to try to get people to see the right path because I think I'm on the right path. And I think there's a humility there that's honorable. And yet at the same time, there's a little bit of a caution because, really all we can say if we're relying on our own intuition, our own kind of reading of things, all we can say is, I think I'm on the right path, right? That's the best that we can do. So there's honor and there's limits, I think, represented in what he tries to do with My Bible. But musically, man, it's inspiring. And then on a deeper theological sort of level, there's some wisdom there to be considered.
Now, Claude, is Nas someone you've been listening to as long as you can remember? You've been into music? Do you have that sort of history with him?
Yeah, I do. So I've been listening to Nas since, I think, seventh grade, conning my stepdad into buying me explicit albums. So Nas and Tupac.
How'd you pull that off? Yeah. Do you remember what your argument was?
I don't think there was an argument. Yeah, that maybe tells, maybe there didn't need to be an argument. So I wish there, in retrospect, I wish there was, but I just got what I asked for.
Okay, got it. Well, glad that worked out for you. And yeah, thanks for talking about Nas here today. Eric, you have an advantage with your pitch because, as I said, I have listened a bit to Japanese Breakfast, but give me some more background on Michelle Zauner and company and tell me why Jubilee is your pick.
Yeah, so if I was trying to sell you on this, I would start by saying that I think 2021 was the year of Michelle Zauner. She is the leader of Japanese Breakfast. I mean, she's really the member of Japanese Breakfast. But she also wrote a best-selling memoir this year called Crying in H Mart, which talks a lot about growing up Korean American, kind of her heritage, kind of cultural changes that she went through, trying to relate to her mother. And then it becomes this really beautiful meditation on grief as her mom gets sick. And she tries to kind of, as an adult, mother her mom through all of that. And so, I think she put out one of the best albums of the year and also one of the best memoirs of the year. And really, to me, is a creative that's really worth paying attention to. And I heard Jubilee before I read the book, but it's hard for me now, having experienced them both, not to kind of put them together in my head, because so much of what I feel like Zauner is doing is trying to find balance between these things that we struggle to balance, like grief and hope, joy and sadness, all of these things that we all kind of struggle with. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But musically with Jubilee, I think I want to make sure I mention that it's just such a great indie pop record. And I think if you like pop music across any of the last several decades, I think you can hear traces of like Madonna's stuff from the 80s and 90s. You can even hear, though, like stuff that's so much further afield, like a Bjork, I think, in some of the songs. And I think maybe one of the contemporaries that she kind of lines up really well with would be a band like Haim, because there's just these really propulsive, really great hooks and just very, pop kind of propulsion to it. But then when you kind of peel back the layers, there's a lot of intricate stuff going on musically, a lot of interesting arrangements and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm a big fan of everything that she's doing. And like a good record store clerk, I guess I would try to push you out the door with more than one thing, which would be an album and a book. But yeah.
Making that commission, right?
Yeah, you gotta keep the doors open, I guess. But yeah, I think, if we want to talk theological resonances, I think for me, it really is that search for balance. I remember, and this is probably not a very new thought at all, but I remember hearing a pastor or theologian one time talk about how God is the only truly balanced being in the universe, that, he's never more just than he is loving, never more merciful than he is, true, any of those things. And we live our lives searching for that balance all the time. And it's so elusive and we struggle to do it. And I just see such a beautiful search for that in Zahner's work. And one of my favorite songs off the record is called Slide Tackle, where she's just talking about this idea of, she just keeps going back and forth. She says, I want to be a good person, but I also want to navigate this hate in my heart. And I want to do this, but I also want to do that. And it just feels like she's really searching to find a consistent way of, navigating through her life. And I think so many of us resonate with that. And even if she's not, expressing some sort of spiritual or theological remedy for that, I think that so many of us struggle with that, and we're looking for examples of that. And so I think Zahner really models that really well, how we can find ourselves holding things that seem disparate or seem like they might be working against each other in each hand, and really just trying to find that balance that only ultimately God possesses.
Well, the Bjork reference may explain why the algorithm brought me to Japanese breakfast. So that might be it. This would be a really tough choice if I had to make it. I'm glad this is just an exercise and I can go spend a little more time with all this music. So thanks for playing along. I do appreciate it. Now, have any of you been able to listen to any of these other picks? Eric, I know that you're a fan of Mountain Goats too.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have a word or two you want to say on that. And yeah, we can mix it up a little bit and get some of your opinions on these other picks.
Yeah, well, I don't know if even John Darnell loves this Mountain Goats record as much as Sarah, but I really like it a lot. And I listened to it quite a bit this year. I feel like I go through this thing with Nas where I forget to listen to him for a couple of years, and then I do, and I remember how great he is. So I was glad to refamiliarize myself with this new one on Claude's pick. The only thing I was going to say is I was so glad that Claude went ahead and tied those first two picks together, because I was thinking the same thing. And there's a line on that My Bible track where he just talks about the idea, like he admits, like, we're living in biblical times. And I think John Darnell is a songwriter who would absolutely say, like, the days we live in are days of like biblical proportion. And I just appreciate that both of those artists really seem to like realize that it's not one thing or the other. They're both very grounded and very earthy artists, but they also acknowledge that there's more going on around them than just what's going on with them. And so I appreciated the chance to kind of revisit both of those and see maybe some interesting connections there.
Nice.
It's funny that you mentioned the sense of like biblical like flavor to both Nas and to the Mountain Goats. So this year actually was my introduction to Nas. I'd never listened to him before. Was delighted to listen to that record, and especially like the sense of history I think that you get. Like there's a couple of tracks like where he's talking about the history of Death Row Records and Tupac and Suge Knight and everybody else. And I appreciated that sense of like depth, and not just we're looking forward towards the way that we're going to be living from here on out, but also looking back to the past and then understanding like this is who we are, this is who we've been in the past, and then this is who we're planning to be and going to be. But yeah, I really, really loved that. I love Japanese Breakfast as well, so I've been listening to that particular record when I'm not listening to the Mountain Goats too. So there's just like it's a clarity, I think, the music for Japanese Breakfast, and then also a clarity to the lyrics that Nas is rapping as well. Like both of them are so, they know exactly what they're going to say and how they want to say it. I was stunned, really, just by how clear both of those were.
I was stunned by the connections, as I mentioned too, and that we've been talking about between the Nas record, My Bible, and the particular record that you highlighted, Sarah, from Mountain Goats. Like I was like, wow. And I think actually one of the lyrics in that Mountain Goats track, it mentions King Solomon, and so I was just like, oh my goodness, these songs pair together perfectly. And I'd like to listen to them more, kind of in succession in comparison, because not, and part of it's the genre, but there's a kind of frenetic like energy to the Nas track, My Bible, a very different feel, obviously, with the Mountain Goats. And so I'd be interested to put those two back to back a little more and think about those. And man, the Japanese Breakfast, I was sold. Like about 30 seconds into that song, I was like, okay, I need to listen to, like, this is my house cleaning music. Like I dig this. So I don't have much more to say besides that. Nas has also put out another album just recently, surprise album around Christmas called Magic. And so I think it's just really neat to see people toward what could be the latter part of their career continue to be inspired and make art that provokes these kind of conversations. And so I found that really, really neat and inspiring. And yeah, I mean, I'm just fascinated at the turn that artists take as they mature and how they sort of try to steward that in what they offer to their listeners.
Well, thank you to all three of you for joining me and doing this. As I let you go, maybe let listeners know where they can follow you. Maybe give us a heads up too on something that you're working on for 2022 that they should keep an eye out for. Claude, this is the year your book comes out, right? Maybe you go first and tell us about that.
Yeah, gladly. You can follow me here when I show up every so often, and then on Twitter, it's just my first and last name. And then in May, my book, Reading Black Books: How African American Literature Can Make Our Faith More Whole and Just, with Brazos, will come out. If you like what we do at Think Christian, just looking at sort of art and culture through a Christian lens, I think you'll really like this book. I try to do that with 10 classic works of African American literature, and you can pre-order it at Baker Books, Amazon, all those sort of places. That'll be dropping in May. So would love for listeners to give that a glance.
I just finished the rough manuscript that you sent me, Claude, today, and I love that you said that because it's exactly, if we had a fiction section at TC where we were doing that sort of writing about novels and literature, it would be this sort of stuff. It was such an enjoyable read. So I highly, highly recommend it for Think Christian followers particularly. How about you, Sarah? What do you got going on?
You can follow me all over the internet, but especially, unfortunately, on Twitter at Dodgy Boffin. That's DODGYBOFFIN. And then this year, cooking up more film writing. And then I've also been filling in a little bit on the Seeing and Believing podcast over at Christ in Pop Culture.
Yeah,
so you
I
may
noticed
end up
that.
hearing my voice a little bit more over there as well.
I love it. Eric, what do you got going on?
There's always things going on. I don't have anything really firm to plug at the moment, but yeah, follow me on Twitter at first and last name. And there, I promise throughout the year, there will be links to essays and dad jokes for everybody. So.
And a lot of writing. I mean, you write a lot throughout the year, variety of stuff. So yes, definitely follow Eric on Twitter to keep up with all that. Thanks again, you three. Have a great 2022. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate it.
Josh Larson again. Before we entirely move on from music, that was some of Faith Healer by Julian Baker. Baker's 2021 album, Little Oblivions. It was one of our favorites from last year and did get some coverage on the TC website. Micah Ricard wrote about it in the context of Romans 7. So you can find that at thinkchristian.net. Okay, let's talk movies, which I'm eager to do with Joe George and Abby Olcese. For me, I don't know, film offered some of the rare bright spots of the previous 12 months. So I'm going to give you this loaded question, the both of you. Was 2021 a good movie year or a great movie year? Abby, I want to start with you.
Oh gosh, it's for me, it's been a really unbalanced movie year. I was surprised, especially toward the end of the year, how ambivalent I felt about a lot of releases. Then as we got closer to the end of the year, I started encountering a few films that I think like the ones that were bright spots were like major bright spots, like ones that I'm probably going to think about for a long time. So like Licorice Pizza and The Power of the Dog that we're going to talk about today. The Worst Person in the World definitely fits that category. I think I'll probably bring that up a little bit in our discussion today as well. Tragedy of Macbeth, just like it was pretty much straight bangers for a while there. So I wouldn't say that 2021 was my favorite movie year overall. That still, in my mind, belongs to 2019 in terms of how many things that I just absolutely loved. I am really surprised and impressed by the number of what I think will continue to be enduring classics that did come out at the latter half of this year.
So that year-end rush that all three of us are familiar with was really strong for you, it sounds like, where, some of the last-minute releases and maybe even catching up with a few things. Okay, that makes sense. How about you, Joe?
Yeah, I'm kind of with Abby on this, that there weren't as many great movies to me this year that there were in the past. There only like 2 or 3 that I think I find myself really... No, probably 5. Pig I really loved. Power of the Dog, obviously. Riders of Justice. Like those kind of handful that I really loved. And then there were a lot that I liked, but maybe not much as everybody else. One movie that we may be talking about here today that I'm not quite as high on. Yeah, okay.
Could that
You're the one that asked if we could be talking about each other's movies, Abby. So you opened the door.
Very excited about this. Let's go right to it because I'm assuming you're talking about Abby's pick, Licorice Pizza. Before we get that opinion, Joe, let's go to Abby. I'll set it up for you here. Licorice Pizza in select theaters over the holidays. I don't know how widely available it's going to be by the time this episode comes out, but it's from writer-director Paul Thomas Anderson. Set in 1973, Southern California basically drifts along with 2 strangely matched characters as they drift along together. Gary is played by Cooper Hoffman, a precocious 15-year-old. Gary is part-time actor, likes to start business enterprises, things like selling waterbeds. And then Alana, who's played by Alana Haim of the band Haim. This is her debut as an actor. And Alana is a 20-something. Her age kind of shifts according to her, I believe, in the film, what she answers about that. But she's a photographer's assistant when we first meet her, who meets Gary during school photo day. And they end up hanging out, getting into different misadventures, not always sure why they're doing that, I think, as the days roll by and they both get older. Abby, as a way into why this was one of your favorites of the year, I would be curious to hear, what do you think these 2 main characters are looking for, either independently or together? That's kind of a question that I keep returning to the more and more I think about Licorice Pizza.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they are both looking for not necessarily romantic love, but like appreciative love and attention and a sense of fulfillment, I think. The fulfillment end, I think, probably applies to Alana a little bit more than it does to Gary. Gary seems like he's still in kind of the performative aspect of his life that comes with, early teenhood, where you're trying to like accomplish things and look important to people. Alana, having gone through the period of my early 20s a little bit closer than the period of my early teens, I really identified with the kind of desire to find something that feels responsible and means something and kind of shows that you are an adult who knows yourself and who knows your wants and needs. And I think they're both still trying to figure that out as characters. It seems a little bit more urgent for Alana, I think, because of her age and where she's at in life and the kinds of things that she's trying to escape versus the kinds of things that she keeps getting pulled into because of her relationship with Gary.
Yeah, that all makes sense. And was that one of the main reasons, that identification, that it made it as one of your favorites, or were there other things going on here that you liked as well?
I mean, there are some hyper-specific things. Like if Tom Waits shows up and wants to set things on fire, I'm going to love that movie. That's just a given. But it's that, and also I think the way that that's communicated, in that Licorice Pizza is sort of episodic and kind of free-flowing in terms of the characters kind of drifting apart and coming back together and realizing they care about each other in certain ways at different times and not always consistently. And all of it kind of leading to a point where Alana realizes what she wants in a specific moment, and that all of the all of the previous episodic things that we've been experiencing alongside her and Gary have led to that moment. Which is interesting because I feel like this is not the only movie that does this, and not the only movie that does this with female characters in a way that I find really fulfilling. The other movie that does this is The Worst Person in the World, I think, where we follow a character through a specific period in her life, which is not all that dissimilar from where Alana is in hers, actually, age-wise. And we kind of come to a similar conclusion where the person that we see at the end is different and slightly more mature and slightly understands themselves a bit better than they did at the beginning in ways that feel both subtle and profound.
Yeah, I hadn't made that connection with The Worst Person in the World, but you're absolutely right. I think the main character there is about 30, right? Maybe a little bit older, but definitely exploring some of the same things. And I think your description of where the characters are at the end of each film is dead on, because from the outside and maybe the benchmarkers of the world, not much seems to have changed, but the interior sense of self has shifted for both characters in significant ways that we do sense in the film. So I like that connection between those two movies. Okay, Joe, if you have reservations about Licorice Pizza, let's hear them. I was a pretty big fan of the film. Didn't make my top 10, but I think it's in the teens somewhere. And yeah, let's hear it. Either if you can speak to this character question we're talking about, or if there are other things that maybe held you back about the film.
Well, so I did like it. I just didn't love it. And I like everything that Abby was talking about. I think every time that it was Cooper Hoffman and Alana Haim together, it was just magical, wonderful. None of the comedy bits worked for me at all. Like, Bradley Cooper did not laugh once. That's Kevin Smith speech put to film. I'm blanking on his name, but Christopher Guest player, that whole bit I found confounding. I don't know that Paul Thomas Anderson is that funny. And I as the movie kind of went on, I found myself resenting those scenes and wanting to get back to the main couple. That was magical. And so, again, I liked it. I don't know what those scenes are doing there. I don't know how to make sense of them, and I didn't laugh at them. So,
yeah.
Do you know who my girlfriend is?
Barbra Streisand?
Barbra Streisand.
Sand,
yeah, like sands, like the ocean, like
Barbra Streisand?
No, like Streisand.
Sand.
Yeah. Well, and, I would say that one scene, and I'm looking up his name now because not that we want to put entirely the blame on him, but it has been getting a lot of discussion. The scene of the character who's starting a Japanese restaurant and introduces us over the course of the film to two Japanese-speaking women he has married, Japanese women, and he speaks to them in this, exaggerated, supposedly Asian accent. John Michael Higgins is who plays the character. The character is Jerry Frick. I will agree with you. It was an interesting experience in the screening. The first time I saw Licorice Pizza, it was mostly critics, so that's the crowd, but, probably maybe 30, maybe 40 people. And when that scene came on of him using that accent, it was not necessarily anger and it wasn't laughter. It was like confusion, it was this shared response of what? So I think that's a case where whatever Anderson meant, and based on his other films, I don't think it was anything malicious. It didn't really work for that scene in particular. Bradley Cooper, I think he was hysterical for me doing this impersonation of a Hollywood producer, John Peters, and kind of came just at the right time to juice things up a bit in the movie and give us a different energy and then kind of go away. And that was good as well. So that issue, at least that character didn't particularly bother me. And yes, if you are going to go with the episodic structure, not really capturing you, I can see that. This is definitely more of a vibe of a film than a story. And the development, as we were talking about before, is very nuanced in the characters. But Abby, you're the bigger fan than me. So how did some of those scenes play for you?
I would agree on the John Michael Higgins scenes. It's not, I wouldn't say it's ultimately super clear what we're trying to pull off there. And given I don't think it's something that's handled with the nuance that it probably should have been, or I'm not even sure that it needed to be there in the first place. I'm not 100% on that. The John Peters scenes, though, those are some of my favorite scenes in the movie. Mostly because I feel like, Josh, as you said, it's like a vibe. I feel like this is, I've never delivered a waterbed to John Peters' house, so I'm not going to say that I have a story like this in my life. But I feel like everybody has like a story like that in their life where they are put in a situation that they weren't expecting with some person with a large personality, and like stuff just gets out of hand and it gets really weird, and you're kind of put at like this strange crossroads of needing to like having to do something that you're not comfortable doing and not sure how to do. In addition to delivering this waterbed to his house, there's a fuel shortage, and the kids end up having to, I think, back a truck, like a cube truck, down a very steep hill.
Yes.
And essentially just coast it down, it's a terrifying experience. It's super harrowing, but I think the best thing that I can kind of compare this to is like if you listen to the Moth Radio Hour, there are a lot of stories like this where it's just like this ridiculous thing happened to me. There are elements of it that are really funny, but ultimately there's like a grain in there of some kind of rite of passage or strange thing that happened that required me to have a reckoning in my life, which I think you can kind of see in Alana's face specifically. I think for Gary, it's kind of happening. There's sort of something in there where he's realizing that he's out of his depth here, and Alana is realizing that she has to like step up and be an adult. There are small movements of character in that scene that I really liked watching and experiencing alongside the characters, and also felt authentic to like the kind of experience that I think a lot of people probably have at some point in their lives, like close to that age.
Yeah, this does feel like sitting down with someone who says, "Oh, and then once this happened to me," and then so, and that jogs another memory that they share, and they're all just so immaculately filmed by Anderson that I was carried along, and. It's right. You're right. These two characters, when you mention adulthood, Abby, for me, it's like they're constantly crossing back and forth across the line of, adolescence and adulthood. Even Alana, as some of the looseness of childhood that she sees in Gary appeals to her, right? That seems more freeing and there's less pressure. And so you think, well, that's kind of why she's hanging around with him. It's a chance for her to lift that weight on her shoulders of adulthood that she doesn't know how to carry yet. This also made me think, about these two characters from a faith perspective. If you talk about faith formation and this idea of being at that age of searching and trying to find some sort of place for yourself, it struck me that even in a faith-filled home, which we see Alana's is, right, where Judaism is practiced, there's a scene of the family praying before a meal. That really doesn't give her an anchor either, even though it seems very deliberate on her father's part in particular. It just isn't real or relevant to her until, to make it has something else is going to have to require it to mean something for her, something other than tradition. Tradition is important, but maybe not always enough. And one of the things that was interesting to me as I was thinking about these two characters is, and it comes to faith formation for any of us, what is the enough? What's going to make it kind of click, even if you've been raised in a Christian home? What's going to make it click for you? Because the larger question for these two characters is, what is going to make life click for me as Alana? When is it going to click? And for Gary, too, when am I going to hit that point of adulthood, which I'm striving so hard for, where things are going to click? And part of it is realizing like it's never going to 100% click and kind of accepting that. So I thought that was an interesting aspect of Licorice Pizza as well. All right, Joe, let's get to your pick. The Power of the Dog also happens to be my favorite film of the year. It is now available on Netflix, so a little easier to find for folks. I've written and talked about it so much. Why don't you go ahead and set it up for listeners who haven't seen it, Joe?
Oh, I got all excited when you did the summary for Abby's movie, thinking, oh, good, I don't have to try to summarize this one. Okay, here goes. The movie's about two brothers, Phil and George Burbank. Phil is played by Benedict Cumberbatch. George is played by Jesse Plemons. They own a ranch in 1925 Montana. George is... He's kinder, soft-spoken, but not quite as with it or sharp, but is more kind, if sometimes a little bit thoughtless. But Phil, on the other hand, is this boisterous, domineering, very loud, manly man. And he is constantly referring to his mentor, friend, maybe more than that, Bronco Henry, as this legendary Old West figure, right? And so George marries a woman named Rose, played by Kirsten Dunst, who is the widow of a man who committed suicide. Phil resents Rose's presence and bullies her constantly, and also bullies her son, Peter, played by Cody Smith-McPhee. And Peter is a not particularly masculine child, which is the reason that he gets the brunt of Phil's wrath. And the movie kind of starts out as this psychodrama and then becomes sort of a Hitchcockian thriller by the end. And I don't want to say too much more besides that as far as plot goes.
Yeah, I think that's wise. I think we should try to tread lightly here because unlike Licorice Pizza, plot is very integral to this movie based on 1967 Thomas Savage novel. Not sure if you mentioned that, Joe, but that's where Campion's drawing the story here. And there are some twists and turns along the way. In retrospect, it's one of those where you're like, oh, I should have seen that. And it's not that Campion is really trying to pull anything over our eyes. It's more about, I think, how the characters respond to some of the realities we become aware of that this movie is really interested in than the surprises or the plot twists. Man, so many reasons I love this film. I've long been a Campion fan, best known before this for The Piano. And I just think she's working at the height of her powers here. Cumberbatch's performance was my favorite of the year. The cinematography is absolutely gorgeous. New Zealand standing in for Montana. But yeah, tell me, Joe, why was this one of your favorites?
Oh, gosh. I mean, all the performances, like you said, and there's a patience to it. I think in the wrong hands, it could become straight thriller. And it's not. There's just such... Campion takes so much time to linger on the subjects, even when she's staging a tense scene. So there's a scene midway through where Rose is practicing the piano and she's doing it badly to prepare for a big dinner party. And Phil is upstairs playing the same tune on his banjo extremely well. And this is him bullying. Like, for a minute, you think maybe this is where they're going to connect and get along. And it turns out, no. Phil is showing off how insignificant she is to him. And the two aren't in the same room. And yet the way that Campion moves her camera around only accentuates just how trapped Rose is. And the way that it just sits on Dunst for a minute to let her kind of walk through the emotions of, I want to make my husband happy. I'm trapped. I don't know what to do about this guy over here. Just the pacing and the movement of these rich characters, I just think is wonderful.
One of my favorite scenes of the year. And yeah, the camera plays so much into that. I love how it's far away from her on the piano at the beginning of the scene and then kind of moves forward. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think when she screws up, it stops and just kind of jostles itself like, oops. And then it starts moving forward again. It's just spectacular. Abby, how about you? What did you make of The Power of the Dog?
I loved it. And actually, Josh, I wanted to ask you, I know after you'd initially seen this, you mentioned to me, I think over Twitter, that it reminded you a bit of The Night of the Hunter. And I wondered specifically if you meant that musical moment.
I did.
Because when that popped up in the film, my mom and I both went, oh.
How about the whistling? The whistling too, though. Like later on, Phil whistles this same tune. Again, he and Rose are not together in the same space. She's outside, kind of in an alley between the house and an outhouse. And he's upstairs at a bedroom window and sees her, and he just starts whistling. So yeah, that's very Robert Mitchum, Night of the Hunter, right?
Absolutely. I think also something that those two movies share, an interest in masculinity and of the performative and toxic variety often. And I think how that relates to women. And also, I think not to spoil too much, but there's some discussion of repressed homosexual desire and tendencies that I think those two movies also share specifically. I mean, Charles Laughton definitely felt that way. Not to make everything about Night of the Hunter as I always do, but
no, it's allowed. It's allowed. It makes sense.
It's
here.
allowed. I think, I was drawn to that. And I thought that was a really interesting exploration of what men think manliness needs to be, and authentic expression of the self, and how it takes different forms and in unexpected ways. And I think some of the movie's more kind of thrillery elements toward the end play with our expectations of characters based on the film's interpretation of their masculinity, I think in really interesting ways that I think is kind of ripe for larger discussion.
Also, some of the more tender moments, I think, work in that with that as well. There's a wonderful scene between Dunstan Clemens where he's trying to express how happy he is to be with her. And when you read that in all of the abuse that he's taken for being the wrong kind of man, and even Cumberbatch has a tender reminiscing scene that is clearly some side of himself that he's not showing to somebody else. I mean, you're spot on. The way that a type of masculinity is a trap and impressed upon other people is, I think, a big part of this movie to add to the trapped feeling that Rose is feeling as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of Cumberbatch's performance is I've always found him to be a very outside actor that sometimes has held me back from his performances. But here, that's part of the role, is to perform these exhibitions of masculinity. And he's just perfectly suited for, pushing that to the forefront, whether it's the vocal performance, how he walks throughout this movie, just kind of taking up the physical space. Really something to watch. So we would be remiss if we didn't address the biblical root of the title here of the film and the title of the Savage novel as well. It's taken from Psalm 22. That psalm, of course, achingly echoed by Christ on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Originally a psalm of David lamenting his torment at the hands of his enemies. Now, the dog references that the film cites, those are in verses 16 through 21. Dogs surround me. And then a bit later, deliver me from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dogs. And we actually see, you mentioned Peter, the teenage boy played by Cody Smith-McPhee. We see him reading those verses, tracing his finger over them in the film's final moments. We won't provide the context of what else has been going on there, but that's when, Campion chooses to literally make the connection. And you think, okay, so maybe it's throughout the movie. I was just thinking, is it just she just wanted to keep the title? Maybe there's more about this in the book, but clearly there's something there the movie wanted to emphasize. I don't know if I've found my way to what that might be, to be honest. So I'd love to hear if the two of you have any theories to that.
I read it as the other dog that shows up, besides the literal dog they sometimes play with, is a shadow on the mountain range that looks like a dog.
That's right.
A barking dog, a snarling dog. And throughout the movie, Phil will look out at the range, and it's kind of this, if you see it, you're his type of person. And he has a moment of connection with Peter where Peter sees it as well. And it's interesting because in the Psalm, David is talking about dogs as something that's attacking him, hemming him in. And there's the sense that when Phil is looking out at the mountain range and at the dog is there as well, that he's hemmed in somehow, right? Like the real him, the authentic him is being held back, and he has to be this performative masculine sort of self. And that's what you see him kind of beginning that cycle also with Peter, that Peter has to be a certain type of man, and the type of man he is not acceptable. And so I thought that was an interesting contrast, that Campion uses all of these gorgeous sweeping shots to show us how wide open New Zealand as Montana is, this sort of freedom that you feel there. And yet there's the sense that, they're trapped in even within this space. And so in relationship to the Psalm, I kind of read it as they're praying for deliverance of some type. Even if the characters don't know what they want to be delivered from, we as the viewers want them to be delivered. We want Phil to just be the type of person he is. We fear for Peter, that they're going to be inherently not good enough. And at least I, as a viewer, wanted them to be delivered. So that's the connection that I saw there.
Yeah, that tracks. How about you, Abby?
I love that, Joe. And I think an interesting element that I think of it kind of in relation to that is there's a mention during like the big dinner scene that before Phil became like this manly man cowboy, he was a classics major and was interested in these kind of more feminine considered things. And I think it's sort of suggested that he sort of sees Peter as the kind of person that he used to be before becoming manly man cowboy, and kind of wants to shape him into what he has become. And I think maybe I couldn't help but feel a little bit sad that those two things couldn't be reconciled to each other, which I think might be part of that message, right? Is that we're hoping that they could have, and that Phil specifically, because he seems to be suffering so much under the weight of that feeling of performance, you kind of wish that he could have the freedom to be both of those things, and the freedom to be able to traverse that huge, beautiful expanse of country around him, being able to be his authentic self and balance those elements of his experience and his personality and his desires.
Yeah, and that speaks to, the way Campion presents so many of her characters throughout her filmography, is that even the ones you might think immediately are, dastardly villains, she's interested in exploring the layers beneath that, and partly the why or the how. And I think we get that here. Phil is the tormentor, clearly set up that way very much in the beginning, but we gradually learn how he may be tormented too, perhaps in his past, definitely in his present, in the way Joe is talking about. So yeah, both the use of the psalm and even that image, Joe, you mentioned, of the clouds forming the shadow on the mountains in the shape of a dog. Those things are both, they have such explosive potential in Campion's hands, and they could mean so many things, sometimes conflicting, but all at once. I think that's what makes her sort of a difficult filmmaker, is it's sometimes hard to pin down what are we supposed to learn from this movie, because it could be so many different things. But there's a richness there that I just appreciate about her work, and especially The Power of the Dog. So more support for The Power of the Dog came from a listener and occasional TC contributor, Jonathan Cana. He emailed us at tcpodcast@thinkchristian.net. Power was number 3 on his top 5 list, and he did highlight that insidious use of, I think it's Strauss's Radetzky March, Jonathan pointed out, in that banjo versus piano scene that we hear. So that was a highlight for him as well. Anything else as far as Power of the Dog goes, or Licorice Pizza, you guys wanted to throw in there before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I think we've covered most of it. This has been a great discussion.
Yeah,
there's going to be no more discourse about either movie, so we nailed it.
That's right. We've answered every question that anybody could possibly have about either one. And,
Joe. Just wait until the Oscar nominations come out, and suddenly these will be the 2 worst films that were ever made. So prepare yourself for that phase. Well, thanks to Jonathan Cana for weighing in there. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Joe. Real quickly, maybe tell listeners where they can follow you and what you'll be up to in 2022. Pop culture-wise. You want to go first, Abby?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter at Abby Olcese. It's ABBYOLCESE. What I will be up to, I have a piece up on TC recently about Guillermo del Toro's Nightmare Alley. I also have a piece that went up about the tragedy of Macbeth and its place in Joel Coen's filmography, which now is expanding to Apple TV Plus in, I think, a week or so.
I think it's going to be on Apple TV Plus mid-January. So by the time this episode is out, it should be available there.
Fantastic. Yeah. So it's ripe for rechecking out, or checking out for the first time now that that has expanded to more viewers. And moving forward, hopefully things won't be continually canceled, and I'll be doing some coverage of some satellite screen events from the Sundance Festival that will be showing in Lawrence near me, and some coverage of True False in March. Fingers crossed.
Sounds good. Yeah, both those titles, Tragedy of Macbeth and Nightmare Alley, I think they're both in my teens for the best of the year. So
they're both
really
so
good films, both of them. All right, Joe, you're going to be publishing The Superpowers and the Glory this year, right?
Yes. Yeah, I'm almost done with the manuscript. So it will be going to the editor in a couple of weeks, and hopefully we'll see print in a couple of months. So, if you're all the way in on superhero movies and you're not sick of them yet, then look out for that book. I'm really proud of where it's coming out. So, yeah.
Congratulations. And to keep up with that, Twitter, is that the best place to follow you?
Oh, yeah. Yes, of course. Thank you. J.A. George II is the best place to follow me, and I will be obnoxious on Twitter about it when it comes out. So
sounds good. We'll look forward to that. Looking forward to some more pieces at thinkchristian.net from the both of you as the year moves on as well. So thanks again. Looking forward to another year working together.
All right. Thanks, Josh.
I don't know about you, but I've come away enriched by this episode. Reservation Dogs was a series I hadn't watched until JR and Michelle gave me the nudge. I'm really glad they did. Nas and the Mountain Goats are now getting Spotify spins from me. Hopefully you've encountered some new stuff, some new music, TV, or movies to check out as we get into 2022. Some pop culture that either reflects the goodness of the gospel, reflects our need for it, or just sits alongside God's story in some compelling way. Thanks to all the listeners who submitted suggestions and picks for this show. We couldn't quote everyone at length, but I do want to get in quickly here a few more recommendations. Josh Baylog said that his favorite album was Hold Still by Taylor Lenhart. In the world of movies, Oliver Chang fell for the Joaquin Phoenix starring family drama Come On, Come On. That was a really good one, Oliver. I'm with you there. Then a couple of TV picks here. Daryl DeClerc highlighted the Netflix series Made, and Tyler Reed had this to say about the BBC series Can't Get You Out of My Head. It's epic in scale, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. Its pessimism reminds me of how lost we all are, but that we do have a great hope in Jesus that justice will eventually prevail one day. Thanks again to all the listeners who provided feedback. And yeah, you can always stay in touch with us by emailing us at tcpodcast@thinkchristian.net. We'd love to share more of your thoughts on pop culture throughout the year in various episodes. You can also follow us on Facebook and on Twitter at Think Christian. And if you want to make sure you don't miss out on any of the articles we publish over at thinkchristian.net, sign up and subscribe to receive our emails over at thinkchristian.net/subscribe. For our YouTube viewers, you missed out on a ton of music for this episode, even more than usual. We have samples from the albums that we discussed, but also tracks from John J. Thompson's Spotify playlist that he compiled for this show. It's a massive one. It combines John's picks for the best of the year, the picks from our panelists, and also listener choices. It's really a nice representation of the music from 2021, and you can hear it by searching for the Think Christian playlist on Spotify. Now, for those of you who do New Year's resolutions, maybe resolve to give us a review on Apple Podcasts in the next couple of months. Star rating would be great. A couple of comments are even better. As we look to grow the show in 2022, that would be a big help getting us in front of new listeners. The Think Christian Podcast is a listener-supported production of Reframe Ministries, a family of programs designed to help you see your whole life reframed by God's gospel story. Our audio engineer and post-production supervisor is John Reeder, and Reframe's co-director overseeing content strategy is Robin Bassel. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks to consider how another aspect of our pop culture fandom connects with our faith.